and I work at Bain Institute for the research department and the publications department. In the research department, I help ustadh Nouman Ali Khan with analyzing the structure of the surahs, and also with supplying information about biblical and Jewish and Christian traditions that are relevant to understanding passages of the Qur'an. So for example, currently he's doing his Surah Al-Baqarah tafsir lectures, and if you watch those, or if you've watched any of his recent lectures, you'll notice that he talks sometimes about the structure of the surahs, and how the surahs aren't just randomly organized and randomly put together, but there's actually a really beautiful structure and pattern in every single surah. And very often the surahs are organized according to principles of symmetry, kind of like a snowflake or something like that. We'll see examples of that tomorrow, inshallah. And secondly, the Quran frequently it refers to the history and the traditions of the Jews and Christians, and particularly in Surah Al-Baqarah, that's very important, because the Quran, much of Surah Al-Baqarah is an ongoing conversation with Bani Israel, with the Jews, and with the Muslim community who are living side by side with the Jewish community. So I help ustadh Nouman with that sort of research. Secondly, in publications, I co-authored this book with him, Divine Speech, Exploring the Quran as Literature, and we'll be talking about that shortly, inshallah. How did I get interested in this field of studies? How did I end up here? So I first started out, I'm originally from upstate New York, or western New York State, and my dad he's a physician from Pakistan. My mom is a white Christian, white convert to Islam from Christianity. And I was raised with a fairly religious upbringing, but when I was probably around 12 or 13, I started becoming more interested in reading Islamic books and I found lectures of different speakers online. And that made me really interested, and I decided I wanted to devote my life to learning Islam and teaching Islam and research and writing about Islam. But I encountered some stumbling blocks. The more I learned about Islam, I was also very intellectually curious in other fields of knowledge as well. And I found that in traditional Islamic discourse, a lot of questions that I had, or a lot of doubts that I had, I couldn't find answers to in traditional Islamic discourse. So for example, on the one hand, I had questions about how do we know, like what's the justification for believing in God? And how do we know that Islam is true? And on the other hand, I had specific questions about, for example, how do you reconcile Islam with the theory of evolution? What about the stories of the Quran? I had read that biblical scholars don't believe, for example, that the Exodus really happened the way that it's traditionally believed, or that the stories of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Ismail, they believe that these stories are all just legends and they don't have any historical basis. Or that the story of the flood of Noah was borrowed from ancient Mesopotamian myths. These were, because I had read about these things, these questions were on my mind. And in traditional Islamic literature, I couldn't find answers to these kinds of questions. So more and more I started to drift away towards a focus on the traditional Islamic sciences. For example, going into the study of fiqh, going to the study of Islamic law. Most Islamic education is geared towards very practical things. But my questions were more intellectual. And as I said, I didn't find the answers in the traditional Islamic discourse. So after high school and a little bit of college, I just started exploring and dabbling in different fields. And so a few issues that I wanted to sort of explore. One was the concept of i'jaz al-Qur'an, that when we, in different Islamic books, over and over again, I found that the Qur'an, the case for Islam rested on the idea that the Qur'an is an inimitable work of literature. It's a linguistic and literary miracle. And that the Quran challenged the Arabs of the 7th century, and they were at the peak of eloquence in their poetry, in their rhetoric, in their oration, and that they weren't able to match it despite having every reason to try to meet the Quran's challenge. And that many people have tried since, but no one's been able to meet the challenge of the Quran. And I thought, that's fine, but I want to be able to experience that miracle for myself. I want to understand, what is it that makes the Quran a literary miracle? What is it that what is it that's supposed to jump out at me when I'm reading the Quran? That this is something that could only be from God. And so I became more interested in trying to understand how to experience that, as opposed to just relying on this historical narrative about the Quran. And so that was one thing that drove me towards Quranic studies, wanting to understand the miracle of the Quran. A second factor was when I was maybe 16 or 17 years old, I first started listening to Ustadh Nouman's lectures. The first lecture of his I listened to was his Divine Speech prologue. And if you've ever watched that lecture, it's basically an introduction to his Divine Speech seminar. And he talked about experiencing the Quran, being able to share the Quran, the miracle of the Quran, in the English language and in other languages to people who don't already know the Arabic language. And he talked about giving examples of that, giving people a taste of the miracle of the Quran, even if they don't have any background in classical Arabic. And so I listened to this lecture and I thought, yeah, that's exactly what I want. That's exactly what I'm looking for. And then I started listening to his tafsir lectures. And the first one I listened to was his tafsir of Surah Al-Kawthar. And I specifically chose this surah for a very strategic reason. I thought, we always say that the Arabs were not even able to produce something like the shortest surah of the Quran, which is just 3 verses. And it's so short, it only takes less than 10 seconds to recite. So what is it about Surah Al-Kawthar that is so amazing that no one is able to reproduce something like it? And so I listened to his tafsir of Surah Al-Kawthar, and he talked about things that I had never heard before. He talked about the placement, the miraculous placement of the surah in the Quran. He talked about how the word choice, how every single word in Surah Al-Kawthar is just fine-tuned with such precision to convey such power and such brilliance and such wisdom. And he talked about how Surah Al-Kawthar contains prophecies that were extremely unlikely at the time they were revealed, and yet they came true. And not only did they come true, but they came true in a way that was unprecedented in history. All in these three short verses. And so when I listened to this, I was amazed and I was dazzled. And I thought, this is what I'm looking for. I want to study every single surah of the Quran like this. Then finally, a third influence on me was I encountered a book called Discovering the Quran, A Contemporary Approach to a Veiled Text by Neil Robinson. And this book was not an easy read. It's pretty technical, this book. You have to read it very slowly and really think about what he's saying. But as I went further and further into this book, I was really struck by 2 things. One, I was amazed by the literary sophistication of the Quran. That this was a Western Orientalist scholar. Basically, his background was in biblical studies. He came to the Quran. He was interested in learning about the Quran. And this is what he found. That the Quran is just this amazingly sophisticated text. The way it's structured, the coherence of the text, the phenomenology of it. He went into detail, drawing from Muslim scholarship and also drawing from Western scholarship, and also presenting some of his own original insights. And so then I really realized what an amazing text the Quran is, and that someone can devote their entire academic life to studying and exploring the sophistication of the Quran. And I was also struck by his methodology and his approach, how he came to these conclusions, how he used cutting edge methods of research, drawn from literary criticism, drawn from biblical studies, drawn from traditional Islamic sciences. And I was just really fascinated by his approach. So after reading his book, I decided that although I have a broad interest in Islamic studies, what I really want to focus on is Quranic studies. As for my other questions, I studied historical criticism, I studied biblical studies. I went through almost every book of the Old Testament with textbooks, commentaries written by scholars, with different secondary literature and biblical commentaries. I explored early Christian studies and historical Jesus studies, and I realized that, and I ended up developing a passion for that subject. Even though originally my intention was to understand the Quran better and answer my own questions, I found those subjects very fascinating as well. And then what I came to realize is that my questions about the Quran, how the Quran tells its stories, the claims that the Quran makes about Jewish and Christian tradition, that the Quran says that it's a revelation in the same tradition as the Torah of Moses or the Gospel of Jesus. And it's actually the culmination of these traditions. And it agrees with them, but it also disagrees with them and departs from them in certain places. And it makes observations and it makes criticisms of the traditions of the Jews and Christians from their own scriptures. And so I thought, to really understand the Quran, I want to understand this biblical history and the history of Jewish and Christian traditions up to the time of the Quran. And while early Muslim scholars, such as Ibn Abbas, radiallahu anhu, up to al-Tabari, Ibn Abbas, he was called the rabbi of the Arabs, because he realized the importance of understanding Jewish tradition in order to understand the Quran. Early Muslim scholars took a very active interest, and they gathered as much information as they could about Jewish and Christian tradition. But today, Muslim scholarship is neglecting that aspect, despite the fact that we now have a couple centuries of very cutting-edge biblical scholarship. But on the other hand, Western scholars, some of whom are Muslim, but most of whom are non-Muslim, it's these Western scholars, particularly with background in biblical studies, they're doing cutting-edge research on the Quran and how the Quran refers to and how the Quran effectively transforms these biblical traditions. And so I realized that I can combine both of these interests, Quranic studies and biblical studies, and I can study them together as complementary to each other. So that's what I decided to do. Now the first step for me in studying Quran would be, of course, to study Arabic. So I ended up applying to the Bayna Dream program. I got accepted in 2013. I did the Dream program, and it was the most amazing year of my life. And then following that, I decided to stay behind at Bayna for an additional year, which ended up becoming 2 years. I didn't quite know what I was getting myself into when Ustadh Nouman told me that he wanted me to write a book with him. I said, oh, a book, that sounds cool. What is it? He said, oh, it's my divine speech class. I basically want to put it into a book form. I said, oh, that sounds pretty easy, I thought to myself. I just take his lectures and I put it into a book form. But later on, I realized that Ustadh Nouman's vision for this book was he wanted it to be the top reference in the English language for the literary study of the Quran. And there's already some really good books on the topic by, for example, Carl Ernst, by Neil Robinson, whom I just mentioned, by Michael Sells. And when I realized the expectations Ustadh Nouman had for this book, I realized that it wasn't going to be as simple as I thought originally. And I ended up, with his permission, taking out some of his material from his divine speech class and adding a lot of new original material. And some of his own research and some of my own research became combined in this book. And although it started off based on his divine speech seminar, it's actually turned into something even larger than that. So I spent the last 2 years focusing on co-authoring this book with him, and at the same time helping him with his research. And fortunately, alhamdulillah, we finished the book. And so now I'm just going to very, very briefly introduce it to you guys. And there will be a lot of content from the book I'll be presenting on tomorrow, inshallah. So the title of the book is Divine Speech, Exploring the Quran as Literature. Here's the front and the back cover of the book. Notice that it says limited edition here. The reason for that is you probably haven't heard of this book yet through social media, Islamic media. So the book hasn't been officially released yet. The date keeps getting shifted around a little bit due to the marketing team being very busy and stuff. But inshallah, very soon the official release will happen. But you guys will get to have a sneak peek at the book. And if you want to order an early limited edition, then I'll provide you guys the link where you can do that. Here's a summary of the book. The Quran, the sacred scripture of Islam, is revered as the spoken word of God by approximately 1/5 of the world's population. Since its inception, the power of the Qur'an has derived not only from its message, but also from the inimitable literary style and rhetorical impact that the Arabic scripture has had on its audiences. Divine Speech, Exploring the Qur'an as Literature, attempts to make some of the most recent Arabic and European language scholarship on its literary features accessible to a wider English-speaking audience. These features include its language and word choice, its use of figures of speech and other rhetorical devices, its manner of narrating parables and stories, and the structure, coherence, and the order of its chapters or surahs. Aspects that typically remain mysterious to readers of English translations of the text. Divine Speech furnishes its readers with a better appreciation of the Quran from a literary perspective, and in the process stimulates interest in and provides tools and resources for further study of the scripture. So this gives you something of an idea of what are the aims and the focus of this book. It's basically to show what makes the Quran so amazing from a literary point of view. Just giving examples of all sorts of different literary features of the Quran. There's a few testimonials we have from various scholars in Quranic studies. Carl Ernst, author of How to Read the Quran, a guide with select translations. He's a professor at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He said, "Divine Speech is a welcome contribution to the literary study of the Quran, providing valuable tools for understanding the style and structure of the Quran. Highly recommended." Raymond Farron, the author of Structure and Quranic Interpretation, a study of symmetry and coherence in Islam's holy text. And he's professor at the American University of Kuwait, professor of Arabic. He's a convert to Islam, by the way. I had the chance of spending a few days with him. He's a really, really remarkable person. He said, "Divine Speech is an outstanding aid for exploring the Quran as a literary text. In a simple and pleasing style, it brings the reader up to date with current research on literary qualities of the Quran and its intricate composition. Moreover, the book offers a wealth of new insights. The detailed discussions of Surahs 1 and 2, the Fatiha and Al-Baqarah, at the end of the book are particularly compelling. Both Muslim and non-Muslim reader alike will be stimulated to consider the Quran from a literary perspective. Overall, a major contribution." And then finally, I'll quote Neil Robinson. He wrote, "The authors of this slim volume have done an immense service to non-specialist readers by summarizing recent research in language that they will find both accessible and appetizing." And that's Neil Robinson, the author of Discovering the Quran, a Contemporary Approach to a Veiled Text, which is the book that originally got me interested in Quranic studies. And I also had the opportunity to spend more than a week with him, and he became a really great mentor of mine. He's just absolutely incredible and amazing scholar. He's both a biblical scholar and a Quranic scholar. Just to give you a preview of the contents of the book's divided into two halves. And after chapter 1, which is a general introduction to the Quran for readers, so the book doesn't assume any knowledge of Islam on part of the reader. This chapter gives the reader the background that they need. But I think even Muslim readers will benefit from this chapter because I think it provides a very concise sort of presentation of Islam, but also of the historical background of the Quran and some of the literary aspects of the Quran. Then the first half of the book is micro-literary features of the Quran. These are features, literary features, which are focused on the level of individual words or sentences or very small passages. So we start off with exploring the amazing word choice of the Quran in chapter 2. In chapter 3, the word order of the Quran. In chapter 4, the grammatical shifts. And this is one of the topics I'll be speaking about tomorrow. It's a very interesting subject. I'll give a word about that shortly. Chapter 5, other subtleties of style and grammar in the Quran. It's basically some other miscellaneous material. Chapter 6, figurative language and imagery, where we explore Quran's use of idioms, its use of imagery, similes, metaphors, and its style of narrating parables. Chapter 7, divine oaths. When Allah swears an oath, for example, wal asr, or wal fajr, or wal adiyati dabha. Like what does that mean? What is the reader supposed to take away from these oaths? That's something we explore in this chapter. And then finally, chapter 8 is a study of Alhamdulillah, the grammar of the ayah, basically the language of the ayah, and showing how every single part of this verse is just, the word choice is just, it's just mind-blowing. And this is really, traditional Muslim scholars have traditionally viewed the word choice of the Quran as being part of its miracle. But how is it a miracle? That's what we try to explore in chapter 8. So that's the first half of the book. Then the second half of the book is focused on macro literary features of the Quran. So we start off in chapter 9, storytelling in the Quran. Basically some of the narrative features of the Quran, for example in the story of Moses or in the story of Joseph. Chapter 10 furthers the study of storytelling in the Quran, but this is focused on why the Quran basically retells the same story in different surahs. Or it tells parts of a story in one surah and it tells parts of the story in another surah. Why does it do that? That's very different from the way we're used to telling stories. And also, how does the Quran take biblical stories and tell its own version of those biblical stories? And why is that so significant? Then in chapter 11, we explore the coherence and structure of the surah. So the surahs of the Quran, at first glance, a lot of surahs, they appear to be almost random collections of discussions of different topics. It starts off talking about, for example, in Surah Al-Baqarah, believers and disbelievers. Then it talks about the creation of the world. Then it talks about the story of Adam and Eve. Then it talks about the children of Israel. And just seems to be going from one random topic to another. But actually, in fact, the coherence of the surah, how all of the different topics within a surah are unified, and the structure of a surah, the way that they're ordered and the way that they're organized, is actually one of the most amazing features of the Quran when you really dig into it. Chapter 12, symmetry in the Quran, how passages and whole surahs and even larger sections of the Quran are organized according to principles of symmetry. Chapter 13, the coherence and structure of Surah 2, the cow. Chapter 14, the order of the surahs in the Mus'haf. For example, why Surah Fatiha, the first surah, Surah Al-Baqarah, the second surah, Surah Ali Imran, the third surah, and onwards. Is the order of the surah something random, or is it part of the grander design of the Quran? And finally, a literary study of Surah Al-Fatiha in chapter 15. And then a concluding note. So this is the contents of the Quran, of this book, Divine Speech, Exploring the Quran as Literature. There's also an appendix on jihad in the Quran, and that might seem very out of place here, but the reason we included this is because, particularly in the study of Surah Al-Baqarah, the topic of fighting in the Quran tends to come up quite a few times, so we wanted to provide some background on that topic for both Muslim and non-Muslim readers. Then, if you're interested, if this book sparks your interest and you want to do more literary study of the Quran, I provide some recommendations for that. And finally, a glossary of Arabic terms and English terms. Maybe I can go to the website right now, but divinespeechbook.com. You can actually order an early version of the book if you would like to. We'll come back to that shortly. As for tomorrow's lectures, first from 12 p.m. to 2 p.m., I'll be presenting on the Quran, coherence, consistency, and structure. And I specifically chose from the Divine Speech book what I think are the most puzzling aspects of the Quran, especially to Western readers, but I think even Muslim readers have the same questions. So for example, I mentioned the grammatical shifts. What are those? By grammatical shifts, I mean sometimes it's not clear immediately who the speaker is. First it seems like God is speaking, but then it seems like God is speaking of. And then it seems like someone else is speaking. Or the audience is changing. Or first it's speaking in the past tense, and then it speaks in the present tense. Or first it's speaking to a single person, then it's speaking to a plural audience. And sometimes within a short passage, a single passage, there are multiple shifts. And so many readers, particularly certain Orientalists, they thought, This shows the Quran is a very, very disorganized and chaotic text. And also the surahs of the Quran, how a single surah doesn't address a single topic or a single theme, but rather it seems to address multiple different things. And they seem unrelated at first. And the order and organization of the subject matter in a surah seems random. But actually, brand new studies in the last few decades have shown that it's not chaotic at all, and it's not random at all, but it's actually a very, very profound and amazing aspect of the Quran. And so that's one of my favorite subjects, and so I'll be presenting on that tomorrow. And secondly, at 4:30 p.m. to 6 p.m., Quranic retellings of biblical stories. So another stumbling block, especially for Western readers, is at first, when they're reading the Quran, they recognize familiar figures from biblical tradition. Abraham, Adam, Noah, Moses, Jesus. But then when they start to read their stories, they notice that the Quranic take on biblical stories is often very different. Or the Quran is telling a story that I don't recognize from the Bible. Where's this story coming from? And certain Orientalists, they thought that when the Quran tells the story differently from the Bible in certain places, they thought the Quran was confusing the biblical story or misunderstanding the biblical story. But further research in this area over the last few decades has shown that actually every time the Quran differs from a biblical story in some aspect, there's actually a very, very profound literary and theological point that the Quran is making. This is another one of my favorite subjects. It's absolutely fascinating, and the sophistication of the Quran and the level of knowledge that the Quran shows of Jewish and Christian tradition is just absolutely amazing and mind-blowing, contrary to what earlier Orientalists thought. So those are the topics of my two presentations tomorrow, and I'd be very happy if you can make them, inshallah. I hope maybe I can show you guys the Divine Speech website. Well, I don't have an internet connection. But check out divinespeechbook.com, and you'll see where you can pre-order the book if you would like, or you can order a pre-release copy. The pre-release copy has some typos that I'm fixing up before the official release, but otherwise it's perfectly comprehensible, and the content will be the same. And I've also been told that sometimes the pre-release or the limited edition version of a book becomes more valuable than the permanent edition. So that might add another incentive for you. So if you guys have any questions? Yeah.
So what were the greatest challenges when you were writing the book?
When I was writing the book, definitely the greatest challenge is figuring out how to explain some very complicated, sometimes very technical or advanced material, and bringing it to a general audience. So if I was writing this book for an academic audience, I could have easily finished writing this in a few months. But when I got reader feedback from readers of all sorts of different backgrounds, it made me edit and rewrite and rewrite and rewrite the book over and over and over again. And so it ended up taking about 2 years. That was definitely the most challenging aspect. Anyone else? Any other questions? Yeah.
You know how you said you studied the Old Testament and New Testament in depth? Did you notice any really obvious similarities between those books and the Quran in terms of literary structure, how they were, I guess, organized?
That's something we'll be exploring tomorrow a little bit, but I would point to one major similarity and one major difference. First, the difference. The main difference when you're reading the Quran versus when you're reading the Bible is the Bible's not a book. The Bible's a library of books written by many different authors over many, many centuries, and with many very different points of view sometimes. And it includes many different genres. It includes narrative, it includes law, it includes poetry, it includes history, it includes all sorts of different things. The Quran, on the other hand, is very homogeneous. It's from, whether you believe the Quran's a divine revelation or you believe it was written by Muhammad or whatever you believe, it's generally clear it's clear to most people that the Quran comes from a single source. And the Quran comes from a very short period of time, 23 years. And so it's constantly addressing very similar subject matter. And another major difference is that the Quran presents itself as a direct revelation from God, speaking to the audience. That's very different from most of the Bible. Most of the Bible doesn't present itself that way, as a direct speech of God to the audience. There's some exceptions. For example, in the prophetic writings, the prophets are communicating revelations from God to the audience. But generally in the Bible, that's not what you find. As for similarities, one of the reasons, or a further reason I'm very interested in biblical studies, is the literary study of the Bible. Biblical scholars have done a lot of literary study in the Bible, and they're still constantly finding out more things. And the more I study these methods and apply them to the Quran, the more literary insights I find in the Quran. So one of the things we'll be talking about tomorrow, the composition of the surahs, or the structure or the symmetry of the surahs. This isn't something that's only found in the Quran. It's found in other literature. This was originally discovered in the study of the Hebrew Bible. And then when these insights were then applied to other literature throughout the world, and especially to the Quran, it turns out that what scholars and readers once thought were very disorganized, chaotic texts actually show a very profound aesthetic and beauty, sort of like the way a beautiful quilt or a beautiful carpet is sort of put together. And there's order, and there's beauty, and there's color in it. And that's an insight that's definitely benefited from developments in biblical studies. Any other questions?
If no one has a question, we have some pre-written questions here. So, this one's a bit relevant for tomorrow, but maybe it's a good example for what people
Sure.
can expect. So, in the Qur'an, Fir'aun, the pharaoh, is described as claiming divinity for himself, claiming that he's the only god. But historically, we know the Egyptians worship many gods. So, if someone comes and says that this is historically incorrect, how would you reply to that?
Oh, funny enough, I do talk about that in tomorrow's presentation. The Pharaoh's claim to divinity. Well, when the Pharaoh says, "Anna rabbukum al-a'la," I am your Lord, the Most High, or he says, "I don't know of any gods you worship besides me." This isn't a denial that the ancient Egyptians were polytheistic. What it is it's demonstrating Pharaoh's arrogance towards his people. And there are in the Quran, there's 2 other verses that clearly state that the Egyptians, they worshipped other gods. So the Quran is very clearly aware of that. But these statements of Pharaoh, they're not denials that the Egyptians worshipped other gods, but rather they're illustrating the arrogance of Pharaoh. Especially that he wanted to be exalted. Actually, it's very, very interesting. I'm convinced with the theory, which is accepted by most historians, that the Pharaoh of the Exodus was Ramses II. And I think I have a picture of this. I do have a picture of this in tomorrow's presentation. He's very famous for his building projects. And one of his is the temple of Abu Simbel. And there's actually, and the entrance of the temple, there are 2 little gods, and then there's a giant statue of Pharaoh himself. So it's as if he's saying, these gods, they're much less important. He's glorifying himself at the expense of these other deities. And that very much fits the character of Pharaoh in the Quran. Yeah?
How do you know when, I don't know how to word this question, but when you're reading the Quran that, you are understanding what the Quran is saying and that you're practicing according to the Quran? Because, when we're taught growing up that, the Bible is not the true word of God and it's the interpretation of what people think God said, right? So how do we know we're not just doing what we think we're supposed to do and knowing we're following what the Quran said?
That's a great question. So my area is in literary study of the Quran, but generally when Muslim scholars study the Quran, they do study it from many different angles, but what people tend to rely more directly on Muslim scholars for is exactly that, the practical application of the Quran's injunctions. So for example, the Quran mentions praying, the Quran mentions performing Hajj, but it doesn't give you detailed regulations about how to do that. And that's something that Muslim scholars they derived by preserving the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and of the Sahaba, and learning it from their example. So, how do you know that you're applying the Quran correctly? You look at the example of the Prophet and of the Sahaba. How did they understand the Quranic injunctions and how did they practice it? And if you have doubts, then that's what Muslim scholars are there for. Yeah. Also,
I have a question since more than 10 years. All of us knows that Quran during our Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was saved on the heart of his companion and his after Ridda wars, most of people who have saved Quran, they passed away. So Uthman bin Affan decided to collect the Quran and to combine all these surahs. Had you mentioned that, and in which aspect Uthman bin Affan and the companion decided to put all these ayahs together to make like Surah Al-Baqarah or Yusuf, Surah Sayyidina Yusuf?
oh, that's a
Had
great
you
question.
mentioned that?
Sure. This is a very advanced, there's a lot of Muslim scholarship devoted to this question, and I haven't really delved into it. I just have the very basic understanding of this topic. I'm very interested, I'd like to pursue it further, but basically, what pretty much all the Muslim sources agree on are that, so the Quran was revealed in various different, some call them dialects, but there are different variants of the Quran that came from the Prophet ﷺ himself, or which he authorized especially for different tribes to recite. And now, when the Quran was revealed, the Muslims they all spoke Arabic. They might have had different dialects, but they all spoke Arabic. And whichever of these different variants of the Quran they were reciting, they understood the meanings very well, and it was easy for them to memorize, and they didn't even need to rely on writing. If they wrote Quran, they used it as a memory jogger, but they didn't have, if you tried to read the Arabic at this stage in history, you wouldn't be able to read it because there are no dots. You can't distinguish between ba, ta, and fa. So it's impossible for us to read. But for them it was very easy because they were using it as a memory jogger. But then as Islam began to spread outside the Arabian Peninsula, and people were embracing Islam, but they didn't have a background in Arabic, that's when mistakes started to occur in the recitations. So now there needed to be a more secure method of ensuring that people are reciting correctly, people who don't have a background in the Arabic language. So what the Sahaba decided to do is that Uthman radiallahu anhu, this was a council of the Sahaba, they decided to these other different manuscripts of Quran, because of the possibility of mistakes, they had those destroyed, and they produced an official version that all of the Sahaba agreed on. And then they made copies of this Mus'haf, and they sent them to the main centers of the Muslim world. But the Uthmanic Codex, it doesn't have, first it allows for some of the different variations, and that's where the different qira'at come from. All of the qira'at are consistent with the Uthmanic Codex. What else is there to mention here? Does that answer your question? Or was there more to it?
Maybe if I join to a lecture.
Sure. I won't be talking about this subject specifically, but I'm just a little tired right now due to a long flight, so I'll be more coherent tomorrow, inshallah. I'll keep your question in mind as well.
Okay. I think I'll just do like the last one question here to kind of follow up on what she was asking. I think what she was asking was, how do we know, like, what type of like evidences are there to show that the Quran wasn't like modified? Because we all believe that the Quran will be protected by Allah and it won't get changed. But is there like any like historical, I guess, evidence to show that it hasn't been changed? Because like some non-Muslims like attack the Quran and say, oh, it was changed after the death of Muhammad. So like, what are the evidence? How do we know that it's been unchanged?
Sure. So one argument would be, like for example, as Fred Donner at University of Chicago, he points out that like Muslims split up into many different groups, political and theological and all sorts of different groups. And these different groups, there were so many things they disagreed on. They disagreed on theology, they disagreed on politics, they disagreed on how to interpret the Qur'an and the Sunnah. And yet, there's one thing, there were the Sunnis, there were the Shia, there were the Khawarij, there were the Qadariya, the Mu'tazila, just so many different sects. And yet, and they all had even their own different understandings of early Islamic history. And yet none of them, they had different hadiths also. And yet none of them had a different version of the Qur'an. None of them said, you guys are wrong, we have the right version of the Qur'an, you guys have a different version of the Qur'an. This is one thing that everyone agreed on. So if there was a conspiracy or something of that nature that there were other variants of Qur'an outside the Uthmanic Codex that are inconsistent with it, or that are different, or there are other surahs or something like that, or there are other versions of a surah, then how did the Muslims come to agree on this? Especially when Islam spread so fast and it splintered so fast into all of these different sects. It doesn't make sense that they would all agree on a single version of the Qur'an if that wasn't the case. That's one very, very powerful argument. Now we have very new manuscript evidence, for example, from the Sana'a manuscripts or from the Birmingham manuscript. You might have heard about these. And these are very interesting. So a lot of Orientalists, they'll say, oh, well, these have variants. But these variants are, as Benham Sadiqi, he's done a very thorough study of this. He showed that the Sana'a manuscript discovered in Yemen in the 1970s, this is really an amazing document, because this is one of the versions of the pre-Uthmanic Codex that was destroyed during the time of Uthman. It turns out it was because they didn't want to dispose of the Quran improperly. So what they would do sometimes is, in these little holes or cracks in the wall, manuscripts they weren't using anymore, they would deposit there. And no one knew about this manuscript until the 1970s, and they discovered it. And are there variants with the Uthmanic Codex? There are. But what's very important and very interesting is that these variants are, first of all, they're very minor things, like a difference in preposition that doesn't change the meaning, using, for example, using and or not using and, or using and using wa versus fa, like very li or ida, like they don't change the meaning. And secondly, these variations don't differ from the Uthmanic Codex any more than Muslim tradition already recorded. Muslim scholars recorded the variants that existed during the time of Uthman. So this actually confirms the traditional Muslim account of how the Quran was compiled and preserved, rather than undermining it.